I've had a request to please get us out in time for everyone to get a seat in the sanctuary today.
Yes.
And those of you who are with me all the time know that's going to be hard. And we're welcoming some friends from Labyrinth class who are joining us today, who've been with us before. So before you dash out of here, make sure to introduce yourself to someone you don't know today. And we have others who will be coming in.
I'm not going to pick it
Some
up.
of you are going to be going because you've got extended care, or because you're an usher, or because you sing in the choir, or because you get mad at the lesson, or whatever. And you're just going to walk out, and that's fine. So whatever you have to do, it's all good. Does anyone not have access to a scripture sheet?
Good. I'm just.
I may not have made it out, but we can share. All right. We got a few left.
Did you get the thing up that I sent to you now? His actual.
All right. I want to say a word of thanks to many of you who have been in touch this week and have been commenting on the column of mine that was published on Thursday by Baptist News Global about some of my health experiences, sort of an update on that, and all sorts of reactions. This may turn out to be my third most read column, as it turns out.
Maybe you'll get on a TED Talk for this one too.
I don't think so. Yeah. Thursday morning, I was sitting at the house, replying to people as they were sharing and posting on Facebook. And if you've not read this column, maybe I'll get Dave to put it out in the email this afternoon.
Yeah.
Dave,
Please.
it's on BaptistNews.com. I'll send you the link.
It shows up on Facebook.
Yeah, a lot of people aren't on Facebook.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're missing out. It's kind of fun.
It's on BaptistNews.com, and yeah, it's a story that I wrote about why I got a tattoo.
Can we see the tattoo? We want to see it.
Oh.
All right.
What is it? Bear paws?
Is it bear paw?
Okay, it's a semicolon, and here's the meaning of the semicolon.
Bear
This is
paws.
actually a larger movement that I didn't think this up. The semicolon is. Yeah, it's a sign that a lot of people use to indicate that they've either suffered serious setbacks in life, or they've been suicidal, or they're depressed. And it's a statement to say, your life is not over, your story is not over, it's not a period, it's a semicolon. Because a semicolon says there's more to come. And so the motto of this is, your story is not over. And so, here's the deal, and this is not really part of the lesson today, but I guess it will be. There are many of you in this room who I know personally who suffer from all sorts of issues. A dear friend in the church reposted my article this week and said, mine is not a physical illness or a physical injury, but it is real nonetheless, and shared this. Some of you have pains of physical problems. Some of you suffer from chronic depression. Some of you have life situations that are putting you down. Some of you have relationship issues, and all of us have different things. And these are tough times, right? Just on the surface. And the reason I wrote this column and the reason I'm being so open about this, I didn't put this on my neck so everyone would see it. That's where the injury really started. But I put it on my arm because it's the thing that failed me. With my spinal cord injury, I could not, you may recall, I couldn't use my arm and my hand for months. And it still hurts. I have good days, I have bad days, and I wanted to remind myself every time I look down at that arm that it's not over. And I want you to know that message too. Whatever challenge you're facing in life, it is not over. This is not the end. There is more to your story. And just because it's not the story you thought it was going to be, doesn't mean it's not going to be a good story. So I want to encourage you in that regard. Please feel free to share this. Thursday morning I was sitting at home responding to people on Facebook, and Allison looked over at me and she said, "Are you going to cry all morning?" And I said, "I might." And she said, "Well, if you are, you need to go to the other room because I've got stuff to do." She was trying to get ready to go to Tanzania, where she is with our mission group right now. And so she wasn't being mean. She just had stuff to do. I want you to know you're not alone. And a lot of you have said to me through the past year, "Well, you're putting up a really good front. I can't tell that you're having trouble." And that's true. A lot of times it is a front because you've got to do what you got to do. And one of the ways you get through is you keep going. And you put one foot in front of the other and you keep living, right? And that's a willful choice that we make. So all sorts of interesting things have happened from this. Darrell was telling me that her niece in Jamaica called to tell her that Mark got a tattoo. And I've already heard reports of some Wilshire college students calling their parents to say, "But Mark Wingfield has a tattoo." So why can't I? Right?
Right.
Yeah. All right. Well, I want to sort of get that out of the way first this morning. This is actually the last of our lessons on the parables, unless some of you have come up with a parable that I don't know about. This is the last of what's been a months-long series on
You'll
this.
be prepared when you and George have that on Wednesday night.
Yeah, well, I'm sort of recycling. Yeah, you should always recycle good material.
Is there not a parable of the semicolon?
The parable of the semicolon. We need to write one for Jesus, I think. Yeah, so our text today is
Who's volunteering to do that one?
out of Matthew chapter 25. And this is a text that you probably already know by heart, in a sense. It's the parable of the sheep and the goats. Matthew 25, beginning in verse 30. Would someone volunteer to read this for us today? Who'd be our reader? Rob?
When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at the left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me." Then he will say to those at his left hand, "You that are accursed, depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me, naked, and you did not give me clothing, sick and in prison, and you did not visit me." Then they also will answer, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not take care of you?" Then he will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life."
Whew, that's a happy one, isn't it? So, little linguistic fun at the beginning here. Is this story a parable? I said it's the last of our parables. And if you go way back to the definition of what a parable is, a parable, Amy Jill Levine defines as a short story by Jesus. And this sort of fits that definition, but it really is marginal parable. Some have noted you could call it a two-verse analogy, and the rest of this explanation of the analogy. But today we're going to call it a parable. Probably one of Jesus' best-known stories, but most of us fail to remember that it really is an analogy. We may also, I think, I found myself doing this, confusing it with a similar parable that we studied earlier, which is the parable of the wheat and the tares. So do you remember the parable of the wheat and the tares? This is earlier in Matthew, chapter 3. Oh, by the way, this parable is only in Matthew. Mark, Luke, or John, none of them have this parable, only Matthew. And Matthew places it way, 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 way at the end of Jesus' journey with us, and I think there's a reason for that. Well, so the similar parable of the wheat and the tares is this is the one where Jesus talks about there's the good crop growing up, and someone comes and sows tares or weeds among the good crop, and when as they're growing up, they look similar, and you can't tell the difference until the harvest, right? And it's sort of the same idea as this. There's two kinds of people in the world. There are the wheat and the tares. There's two kinds of people in the world. There's the sheep and the goats, right? And so these things are built on that same idea. Now, I want to sort of do a compare and contrast on this, because the parable of the wheat and tares is often used to scare people into salvation. That certainly was the case in my upbringing. The second time I was baptized growing up, the second time I was baptized growing up was because a really famous evangelist named Bailey Smith came through our church and preached his famous sermon on the wheat and the tares. Some of you have heard me tell this story before.
Yes.
I looked up on his, he died a year or two ago, I think.
You bring Bailey stuff.
Are you saying
No, Bailey Smith, not Bailey Stone.
Smith, not Bailey Stone.
Bailey Smith was a pastor in Oklahoma, was president of Southern Baptist Convention. He's the one who famously said in 1980, God does not hear the prayer of a Jew. Y'all remember that one?
Yes. Very well.
Yeah, so that's Bailey Smith, okay? And so he had this really famous sermon. He would go, and the deal was he could rack up big numbers because he got all the deacons and clergy and their wives and good kids like me saved again. And so it raised up your baptism numbers, right? And the way this sermon went was to talk a very graphic depiction of the end times, as if Jesus himself were walking down the aisle of that sanctuary among you at the last times and separating out those who were really the wheat from those who were the tares. And did you really know? Did you know beyond the shadow of a doubt that you were really saved? And I mean, who does? Right?
If you're 9 or 10 years old, for sure.
And so, I'm like a 14-year-old kid who's pretty, rule following and all this. And I didn't know that I was 9 years old when I was baptized. Maybe I didn't really mean it.
Possibly.
Right? Possibly. By the way, this is why we will not baptize your 5-year-old. Right? Anyhow. So this becomes a part of our Christian culture. Here's what bothers me about this, though, in comparing these two parables. In the parable of the wheat and the tares, there's no measure given to know whether you're the wheat or the tare. You sort of have to wait to the end to figure it out, unless you know in your heart, or you keep getting rebaptized. Which in some churches, that's a good thing.
More numbers.
But in the parable of the sheep and the goats, there is a very clear measure given. It's different. And here's the thing that really rubs me the rawest right now. That very measure that Jesus gives in this parable is one that most American evangelical Christianity is failing right now. We're failing. The church has lost it on this. So I want to give an example from this week. Does anyone know the name John MacArthur? Well, just as well. So in that broader evangelical American Christian world that's out there, there's been a very influential pastor named John MacArthur. And he is a Calvinist, he is a fundamentalist, but he's been very, very influential beyond his realm.
He also has his own study Bible out.
And his own commentary set.
Yes.
Jacob Topper was telling me this week that the very first commentary set he ever owned, his mother bought for him. It was the John MacArthur commentary set.
Oh.
That when he finally wised up, he went and sold at Half Price Books for $30. And I said Half Price Books gave him a gift. John MacArthur is he's representative of that kind of severe apologetics that was prominent in the 70s and 80s in particular, where you've got Josh McDowell wrote a book called Evidence That Demands a Verdict.
Right.
And everything, you had to be able to, everything's black and white, right? Well, so John MacArthur has spearheaded this past week or two a statement of theology against social justice.
Oh.
And I'm going to read you 2 excerpts of it. 1, we deny that anything else, whether works to be performed or opinions to be held, can be added to the gospel without perverting it into another gospel. This also means that implications and applications of the gospel, it's also really arrogant language, such as the obligation to live justly in the world, though legitimate and important in their own right, are not definitional components of the gospel. Let me say that again. Implications and applications of the gospel, such as the obligation to live justly in the world, are not definitional components of the gospel. I think he's not read Matthew 25.
He does read a different Bible, doesn't he?
And then this one.
Probably wrote part of it.
We reject any teaching that encourages racial groups to view themselves as privileged oppressors or entitled victims of oppression. While we are to weep with those who weep, we deny that a person's feelings of offense or oppression necessarily prove that someone else is guilty of sinful behaviors, oppression, or prejudice. And I haven't even gotten to the part about women.
Oh!
To be submissive. And here's the deal. As of yesterday when I looked, 6,258 faith leaders have signed this statement online.
Wow.
Chad.
He was the one that you could go get certified in. You could go to the trainings, and he had the notebooks. And he was the one who also, he had the picture of the hammer and the nail, and the husband was the hammer.
Bill Gothard.
Oh, that was him. I was like, that sounds just like
same,
him.
Same kind of rigid theology, right? Okay, but this is alive and well among us today. It's influencing Christianity. So if you hide out at a place like Wilshire and you don't know this is going on in the world, right? It is. Some of us have come from this, right? I know some of your stories as well. Well, so here's the deal with the parable that Jesus is telling today. The reason Matthew places this story at the end of the gospel is this is what got Jesus killed. If you go back and read the whole way through, you'll see that it's after this story that the religious leaders say, we got to get rid of this guy because he's messing with our business.
Had business, that's right.
Right? They couldn't tolerate Jesus anymore, and they plotted to kill him. And here's the point to us today. Reminding people of these words of Jesus will get you in hot water still today. It will get you, people say, well, you're just being political. Well, sometimes you're just being biblical, right? And if it's political, that's on someone else, right? I didn't make it political. Our system may make it political. So let's think about this parable and the teaching that Jesus has given. And can you come up with some examples of how this is a tough thing to talk about? Immigration. Yeah, immigration. Hold that one for a minute. I'm going to come back and talk about that specifically as an example. What are some others?
Low-income housing.
Yeah, if you don't care about housing,
Or you
exactly.
want it, you just don't want it, right?
You just don't want it by you. We want them to live somewhere, just not here, right? And not there. Yeah.
Medical insurance.
I need medical insurance, but I don't really care whether you do or not because you ought to get it yourself.
Right.
Yeah. Other?
Plus, there's no excuse for you to live in South Dallas. You could have brought yourself up by your bootstraps and made your life better. You know, there's no reason for you to be a criminal or someone desperately poor.
Or unemployed.
Or unemployed.
Okay, you see the kind of problem, and Jesus says,
Least.
when you do something under the least of these among us, you're doing it to me. Because Jesus identifies there as well. So I want to take just a note on the immigration issue. Don't care who you voted for in the presidential election, this is not about that. Because, here's why. What's happening on the southern border here in Texas is not being done by a president, it's not being done by Congress. What is actually happening down there is being done by hundreds and thousands of people who you don't know and have no name, who are willingly going to work every day and putting people in jail and separating families from their children and sometimes making jokes about it from the accounts we've read. I'm sure many of these are good people, but those orders cannot be carried out unless people are willing to do them. And there are people who are physically present running these jails for little children, going to work every day, doing it, executing all of these things that are happening, that we're up here saying, man, this is horrible. But what if our livelihood depended upon following that order too? What would we be doing? There's the hard part, right? And I'm sure there are a lot of these folks who are residents of our state who live down in the South, and they are torn. Some of them maybe are not torn. I bet you a lot of them are in church this morning, somewhere. This is Texas, after all. We do go to church, right? And I find it just astonishing that we can treat other people so hatefully, with such meanness, and then come to church and read this scripture, where Jesus says, what you do unto the least of these, you're doing it to me. And in the parable, people say, but when did we see you, Jesus? When did we see you? And the point of that, I think, is that if you think about the context of where Jesus is telling this story, here are people who don't know democracy. They have no idea what democracy is. They live with kings and rulers and subjugation, right? And they know that if you know that someone's the king or royalty, you're going to act nice to them. I mean, we know that too, right? If someone important's coming over, you put out good stuff. And you clean up and whatever, right? And yet, if it's someone who's not so important, maybe we don't. And Jesus is upending the whole thing once again. Remember, the point of a parable is to shock us. It's to say, wow, that's outrageous. And so that's why Jesus tells this story, because it would be outrageous in this context as well. So, well, I got off on that. Response, thoughts? Yes, and then...
A good friend of mine in an exercise class I go to is actually from the Cape Cod area, and she spent some time up there this summer, and she's pretty political down here. She was horrified to realize that after visiting with some friends in that area, they knew nothing or very little about the immigration crisis and had absolutely no interest in it. It was totally meaningless to them because they're so far away from it. So all that was going on in Texas, she couldn't find anybody that really knew even much about
Well,
it.
and no doubt there are people who live next door in Texas who don't. You can segment your life in such a way, right? Yes.
I was just going to say, I studied a lot of stuff after World War II, and like when you listen to some of the accounts of the people that worked, like Nazis that worked, they just said, well, I was just doing my job. And that's kind of what it sounds like at the border. People are just saying, I'm just doing my job without care for just humanity.
So you can go throughout Christian history here, right, and find ways that Christianity has been used to oppress other people, which doesn't seem to be the point of what Jesus is saying.
This may be stepping on toes, but I'm going to say it anyway. This kind of sorting out of different folks always reminds me of the hysteria when the whole AIDS thing came out. And I was still working full-time in healthcare. And, I mean, we had it right here. And it was like, okay, we've got to face this. We've got to treat everybody. And it was the whole thing of, do we wear gloves with the ones whom we know have AIDS?
Yeah.
Or do we wear gloves with everybody? Are we treating them differently, or what do we do? I wasn't pregnant, so I didn't have to worry about the potential consequences there, but it was a huge deal.
Well, and those of you who've been here a long time know that Wilshire has a history in this story as
Yeah,
well.
that's what I'm saying,
Right,
the whole Wilshire
yeah,
thing.
Cody.
Well, it's what the young lady said about Nazism or that. But it seems to me that America is definitely meaner. Maybe I'm old, but the whole anything, immigration, housing, whatever, it seems that people just say, well, it doesn't affect me. If it's not next door in my next door neighbor's lot.
So what is the root of this? And I want to propose the root of this is selfishness.
Right.
Right? That we all are looking after our own self-interests, which is the human condition. And this is what I think Jesus is trying to get at in this parable, is to say that if the seeds of the gospel really have taken root in you, you're going to look at the world and other people in a different way than just through your own lens of self-protection. Linda?
I think it's important, piggybacking on what you just said about selfishness, to remember that evil is selfishness.
Well, that's a good point. Yeah, evil is the ultimate selfishness in a way. And I'm going to pick up on what Joni said. You got to educate yourself too, right? All of us have this. I'm sure we've all been there. Those of you who are on social media, people post stuff that it's not plausible that could even be possibly true. And you want to say, did you think for a moment about that before you posted that somewhere?
Shared that.
Right? Just stop. But if it confirms your own biases, you're going to put it out there without thinking, well, no, they're probably not space aliens who run a McDonald's, right? I mean, whatever it is. Not likely that's the case. And yet we sort of set reason aside. And to the AIDS issue, to any of these issues, being informed and being aware of issues helps us be better people and better Christians. I've told some of you before, the single worst tongue lashing I've ever gotten in this church for a prayer that I have prayed came when I used the word ignorance in a prayer during the Ebola crisis. And I prayed that God would help us overcome our ignorance about this illness. And there was a then member of the church who just took me to task because he thought I had called him ignorant. And everyone in his family and what I was trying to say was we're all ignorant, right? We all need to learn, right? And here's what we face with this. Okay, now hold all that aside. Let's dig into the text of this just a little bit more.
Mark, there was one more comment.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, well, now that you moved on and come back. Well, I have a couple of different reactions. One, it's very hard to be informed in this world, this era, because, I have my own views, and on my list of sites I check every morning are several that are pretty obviously reinforcing my own biases. And it's just more difficult now to hear the other side of the coin. One thing that is making me uncomfortable with your commentary, some of my more conservative friends would react with, setting aside the border issue, because I don't know how anybody can see that one as other than what it is. Well, look, it's not that I don't agree that we ought to not help those that are in need, but it shouldn't be government as the actor, it should be something else as the
Okay.
actor.
Okay.
Fair enough.
And so,
Yeah,
that's one of the
so
reactions I have.
show me your tax returns and tell me
No,
what
I'm
you give
with
to
you.
your church.
Now, I'm with you, that
Yeah.
I think in practice, people don't actually do that.
Yeah, I'll tell you from my experience as a pastor, not all the time, but a lot of the time, people who complain the loudest about the government should be doing this are not helping the church do it either.
Yeah.
So if you want to say the church should do it, that's fine. The church does not have the resources to do it. Let's talk about that. I think it's a fair conversation.
And my third reaction, I love this story, but I've raised sheep and I've raised goats, and sheep are stupid, and goats are very cool breeds.
Yeah, I'm getting there. So here's the deal about the sheep and the goats. Yeah, so Lance grew up on a ranch, right? And here's where people miss the boat on this. This is one of these things that has lost its, we've made it something over time that it shouldn't. Ultimately, the comparison here is not about sheep and goats. It's about left and right. And it just so happens sheep and goats are the example that Jesus used, and Jesus is not maligning goats.
They're saying that we should be like the stupid sheep.
Yeah, so you're right, sheep are stupid, and so Jesus is not trying to rehabilitate sheep and oppress the goats.
All right.
Right? That's not what this is about. Yes.
On that note, then, since it's not sheep and goat, it's left and right. For those who find themselves on the left, Jesus has prepared for those on the right. But he made no preparation for those on the left, and then they were cast into what was prepared for the devil and his angels. Hell wasn't prepared for human beings, so why did he not prepare for those on the left? Why do they get the same kind of punishment? All of them on the left.
Could y'all hear this question?
And in real life, whenever you're judging somebody, the punishment for the crime is not the same for everybody. Why all the people on the left, if they're not both, they get the same punishment? Hell.
Darrell wants a sliding scale. She wants Jesus to grade on the curve.
As all of us do.
Don't we all?
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
So let me tie several things together with this. The talk of left and right is not saying the left is bad, the right is good either,
Right.
or vice versa. It's simply talking, it's a metaphor for talking about separation. Group A, Group B, this group, that group. It so happens this group's called sheep, that group's called goats. This group's called left. It was a common linguistic device in the day that Jesus is picking up with this.
There's no way to be middle.
On this issue, no. And I think there's the point. And this is the thing Jesus is trying to say. On this issue, if you're going to be like Jesus, right? If you're going to follow Jesus, you're either following Jesus or you're not following Jesus in this case. So think about the example Jesus has given himself. Who did Jesus eat with? Prostitutes, sinners, tax collectors. Jesus walked the walk and not just talked the talk. He's inviting people to follow in his footsteps with this. And what he's ultimately saying, I think, and I'm sorry I'm jumping ahead here, we'll come back to this, is that the proof is in the pudding, right? That if you really follow me the way you say you are, there will be evidence of that in your life, in the way you treat other people. That you don't seek only your self-interest. I mean, go throughout the New Testament, verse after verse after verse, where Jesus is portrayed as the one denying self, taking up the cross. Go read Philippians chapter 2. Being in the form of being God, but born in the form of man, humbled himself and became obedient even unto death on the cross. And the model that Jesus has given over and over again is to deny self, take up this journey, and live in another way. But yet, so many of us live in such comfort, relatively, that we're blinded. We're blinded to this, right? It's so hard with that. All right, I want to get back to two ways of reading this, because there's another important thing here. In verse 32, there's a little phrase, that in Greek is panta ta ethne, and the phrase literally means all the nations. But many times in Matthew, both this word ethne and pante te ethne, also refer to the Gentiles, those who are not Jews. So there are scholars who've read this passage and said, now wait a minute, what Jesus is talking about here is you got to show kindness to people who are in the group, in the church with you. This is all inside. Don't be like the Gentiles, all right, who are separate from this. Now here's the problem with that. If this phrase, if you want to make it, and it's a hard reading to do, but you can do it, refers only to the Gentiles, then the term least that's mentioned later in this passage most likely would refer to Jesus' followers or missionaries. And the passage then tells us that the Gentiles judged according to their hospitality to Jesus. The Gentiles are going to be judged on whether they were hospitable to Jesus' followers. So this is about judgment for the Gentiles. Okay, now, you can't get off the hook as easily on that as you think, because what it also was saying then is if even the Gentiles who know nothing about the Jews' deep tradition of caring for the stranger and know nothing about Jesus' message to love as God loves are expected to know enough to feed somebody who is hungry, clothe somebody who's naked, and heal somebody who is sick, regardless of who they are and what they believe, then how much more should good Jews and Christians care for all people? If even the Gentiles can do this, why should we not do it, right? And there is a deep, rich tradition in Judaism of all of these things that Jesus is saying. The very examples he's given are embedded in Jewish teaching through the rabbis, through the centuries. So this is not, Jesus isn't making up new stuff here. He's sort of hauling out the greatest hits and saying, here's what matters in this. Now, here's the problem with the way we typically read this passage, though, where we say that Greek phrase I've read to you refers to all nations, all peoples. All people will be judged, right? You could read this passage and say, well, then our justification is by works. Because Jesus is saying what really matters in the separation to come is what good works did you do? And now we're getting really nervous about this because, I mean, we Baptists don't like that, right? Saved by grace through faith, right? And now we're back to the battle over the book of James as well, right? So how do we get around this? Oh, we've already talked about sheep and goats. That's good. That's going to save me some time there. Well, let me propose another way of reading this, and that is this. What if we read this parable as Jesus teaching us the importance of living by faith rather than living by fear? If you go right before this in chapter 25, Matthew has Jesus telling the parable of the talents. You remember that one where the rich man gives money to 3 different people to handle in different ways, and one invests it and does this, and one invests it, and one buries it in the ground because he's afraid, right? And the message of that is don't be fearful, right? Take what God has given you and use it. That's directly before this parable, the way Matthew tells the story. Fear paralyzes us, and if Jesus was about anything, it was motion, moving us into a different reality called the kingdom, and the Spirit of God who moves us through the world. Now, think about fear, though. How is fear used as a motivator in our world, and how do we fall victim to it? What are some examples?
It's used politically.
Oh, it's the number one political tool always.
It's number one
Yeah.
political tool.
Yeah. Someone's going to take something you have and give it to someone who doesn't deserve it.
Right.
Your sermon about the wheats and the tares.
Yeah, fear. Yeah, the reason I was baptized the second time was I was scared to death as a 14-year-old, right? What's another example?
I think a lot of us parent based on fear. Am I doing a good job?
I'm going to ruin my kid. Yeah, and sometimes we parent by fear too. Yeah.
I think a fear of being separated from God. Yeah.
Yeah. Fear is such a very strong motivator, right? It's probably the ultimate. Well, pain is a good motivator, but fear and pain go together. I mean, that's what torture is about.
Right.
Both of those put together. So, how can faith be an antidote to fear? I want to give an example. If you think back to those of you who are here 4 years ago, is it 4 years ago now?
Yeah.
3 or 4, during the Ebola crisis. The single claim to fame we had here was preaching and living out a message of faith over fear. If you think about what George said from the pulpit, if you think about what we said on TV and in all the interviews, time and time again, is we're going to be filled with faith before we're filled with fear. And this was a city that was on full-on panic attack.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know, some of you may remember me telling the story that back in those days we had Food Truck Sunday occasionally. And during that time, we were to have a Food Truck Sunday, and I had a food truck owner cancel on me on Saturday before Sunday because he was afraid his workers were going to come to this church and get Ebola. He was so motivated by fear.
Oh, my.
And I tried to reason. I said, Mr. Duncan, Louise, they have not been, none of them have been here since anyone has been exposed to Ebola. Mm-hmm. Well, I just can't run the risk, right? Because fear had completely taken over all reason from him. And so, not in that example only, but in all of life, we have the ability to say there's a way to see this another way. So that's why I told you the story of the tattoo this morning as well. Because for me, this is a way of saying to myself every day and multiple times a day, there is a way to live with faith rather than fear. There is a future that's out there, even though it's not the future I may have wanted, right? These things actually do sort of connect with that. Here's what one commentator says. When read with faith rather than fear, this passage actually moves the reader into a space of holy assurance that empowers action more fitting in the kingdom of God. When read with trust in the faithful God, the focus shifts from a prospect of damnation to the possibility of participation in the coming kingdom of heaven and eternal life. So do you get that? If we read this parable and only focus on the separation and the damnation, we're going to be scared to death. But the parable actually can call us to our better selves if we focus on the possibility of salvation instead. Why is the glass half empty when the glass can be 100% full on this side? And here's the other deal. Food, water, clothing, hospitality, companionship, these are not only the most necessary elements for communal life, they are the most readily available gifts to give. The very things Jesus talks about here are the things that we all have the capacity in some way to give. The lesson of the sheep and the goats, this commentator says, is good news because it asks each to share precisely what each of us have. That's the true center of this passage. Whether it's food or water, a compassionate ear, or an open heart, everyone has something to share. Now, here's my last thought for the day on this. I know that sounds crystal clear right now because I've just explained it so beautifully to you, right? Why do we all still struggle with this passage so much? This has got to be one of the best known verses in the Bible, short of Jesus wept and John 3:16, right? It gets quoted all the time out there, usually to put someone else down or build ourselves up. why do we still struggle with this? What's up? True confessions, anyone?
Prideful.
Prideful?
We're prideful. We think that we know better than God, and we don't, and we forget. And we have to be reminded.
Requires self-sacrifice, which is against our nature.
Self-sacrifice is against human nature. Okay, Linda?
I think we struggle because we always keep wondering if we're really doing enough. We know maybe we're trying to be a sheep, but we always wonder. That's one thing. And the other thing is that the older you get, the tendency is to worry that I gotta take care of myself. I don't wanna run out. I don't wanna have to depend on others, so I wanna be sure that I've got enough. I mean, this is.
Oh, yeah. And I think this is probably one of the most common issues as we age, is thinking, will I have enough resources to sustain my life?
Correct.
I mean, this is enormous, right? And it refers to, the parable's greatest hits now. Remember the parable of the man who built bigger barns,
Oh, yeah.
right? Yes, and someone had a hand.
Well, that's exactly what I was gonna say, is the tendency as we age is to live in your own little shell. And in order to break out of that and do this, you've got to open yourself up to whatever comes along. You know, you just can't stay at home and count your money or come
And
to
that's
church
scary,
and think you're
scary,
being
scary
good
stuff,
just because
right.
you're here on
Yeah,
Sundays.
Cody?
I don't think we thought about it when we were some of these wonderful young people's time. I mean, you were parenting, you were trying to keep your job, you were trying to buy another house, whatever you were doing. And then all of a sudden you become, I don't know, pick an age. Some people it's 45, some people it's 70. And you think, well, diddly darn, there's my account. And shit a bug.
Okay, Lance.
My comment is, at your age or my age, that the motivations may be different, but the effect is the same. I'm worried about, have I paid off my student loan debt? Am I gonna have enough saved up for my kids' college? Am I gonna be able to pay all the things?
Exactly.
You're worried about, am I gonna have enough left? And all the stages in between, there's always something where we're putting ourselves above other
Right.
people.
There's always something.
Right.
So what about the goats who are philanthropists?
What about the goats who are philanthropists?
Oh, what would we do without her? She's our resident rock.
The thing about this parable that scared me was some years ago, quite a few actually. I had a friend, a dear friend, who was a practicer of Siddha Yoga. So while I lived in Wisconsin, and the Guru Mai came to Wisconsin, and he was and her main teaching, and the main teaching of yoga, of Hinduism, is God exists within you as you. And then when I thought of this story, I thought, well, what if Jesus, when he said, "You're doing it to me," meant it? What if he meant, that's me that you're doing it to, that I'm in each person?
That's pretty deep.
Oh, that's real deep.
You know, but I mean,
Yeah.
it was like blowing my mind because on the surface, what she says sounds like heresy to a Christian.
Yeah.
But if you think that way, maybe not.
Well, I think it's not that far from what Jesus is saying, actually, right? When we see other people, are we able to see the face of God in them? And man, that is hard work. And we've sold Christianity too often to be easy. And it's not.
No.
And I think today's parable helps us see that as well. I hope we've given you something to chew on today, maybe something to be mad about, something to be challenged about with this. Those of you who are in Discovery class, you're wondering, what are we going to study next week? I don't know yet. I have some ideas. You've been giving me some input, and I'll let you know this week. If you have further input, please talk to me, email me, whatever. I hope everyone will stay for the church photo today and for the service as well. We're actually doing the photo at the end. This is like going to the gospel mission. You got to hear the sermon before you get the food. Right? So you can't be in the picture if you're not there for the whole service as well. It's our way to get you, with that. Okay, we're going off camera now, and goodbye to our live stream friends. Let's take just a moment and hear your